As we already know, intercultural communications are a necessity today because these skills enable us to adjust to our closest surrounding, but also to be global citizens and to be able to do our work in a general context. This is a quote that I often use when I talk about intercultural communication, that isolated cultures stagnate, while cultures that communicate among each other achieve progress. So now we go to the issue of identity and intercultural communications. We all know that identity is about who we are and who others think we are. How do we come to understand who we are, and how do we communicate our identity to the others? There are different theories about this issue, and the theory that I decided to select here is that of impression management, and it's given by Goffman, who says that this is how people present themselves and how they guide the impression others form of them. What is the identity? It's the relationship between the I and the other. There is no identity with the other. This clearly says that we cannot talk about the identity as an isolated thing, as an isolated issue. It is always related to the others around us. We also have to consider, as it is said in the third statement here, we also have to consider the foreign identity, or maybe the identity of the others. There are three perspectives on identity and communication. The social science perspective, which says that identity is created by self, by relating to groups. We relate to different kinds of groups that we decide to belong to. Then we have the other perspective, which is interpretive perspective, that identity is formed through communication with the others. Something happens as a result of the communication that we have with different parties, with different groups, with different individuals. And what happens in this process that we can often change our habits, we can change our perspectives of seeing things. Maybe we start with one thing, but then we modify it through the process of communication. And then we have the third perspective, which is so-called critical perspective. Identity is shaped through social and historical forces, something that refers to the fact that as the time goes by, there are changes, and history marks different changes that can happen to the identity formation. Two kinds of identity. We have the personal identity based on the culture in which we were socialized, and we are still socialized, and the cultural identity founded on the sense of belonging to a community with certain characteristics. That was just a brief overview. You have lots of details about the identity formation in the materials which are attached for the third week of the course. What I thought would be useful to mention during this discussion today is the identity development issue. People can identify with a multitude of groups: gender, age, religion, nationality. These are just a selection of a couple of groups. Our identities develop over a period of time and always through the interaction with others. In the theory, there are also different types of models that describe how minority and majority identities develop. Although some models center on racial and ethnic identities, they may also apply to other identities such as class, gender, or sexual orientation. So let's start with the way the minority identity is developed. In general, minority identity tends to develop earlier than majority identities. For example, straight people tend to not think about their sexual orientation identity often, whereas gay people are often acutely aware of their sexual orientation identity being different from the majority, and develop a sense of sexual orientation identity earlier than people who are straight. Similarly to this, while whites may develop a strong ethnic identity, they often do not think about their racial identity, whereas members of racial minorities are aware of their racial identities at an early age. There are several stages in the minority identity development. Stage 1, it's the unexamined identity. It's characterized by the lack of exploration of identity, regardless if it's racial, ethnic, sexual orientation, etc. At this stage, individuals simply lack interest in the identity issue. Minority group members may initially accept the values and attitudes of the majority culture, expressing positive attitudes towards the dominant group and negative views of their own group. You have a couple of examples here, but in the interest of the time, I would proceed because there are several things that I wanted to share with you today. In the second stage, we have conformity. It's characterized with the internalization of the values and norms of the dominant group and a strong desire to assimilate into the dominant culture. Individuals at this phase, what is interesting is that they might have negative attitudes toward both themselves and their group. There is an interesting example here. One young Jewish woman said, "I tried very hard in high school to not let anyone know I was Jewish. I would talk about Christmas shopping and Christmas parties with my friends, even though my parents didn't allow me to participate at all in the Christmas celebration." Stage 3, it's the resistance and separatism. Many kinds of events can trigger this move to the third stage, including negative ones such as encountering discrimination or name-calling. A period of so-called dissonance or a growing awareness that not all dominant group values are beneficial to minorities may also precede this stage. There is a small mistake here. International students sometimes develop their national identity as a minority identity when they study overseas. Stage 4, it's the integration. The ideal outcome of the identity development process is the final stage, which is the achieved identity. Individuals who have reached this stage have a strong sense of their own group identity and an appreciation of other cultural groups. At this stage, they come to realize that racism and other forms of oppression occur, but they try to redirect any anger from the previous stage in more positive way. The end result is individuals with a confident and secure identity characterized by a desire to eliminate all forms of injustice. What are the stages of the majority identity development? The first stage, it's the unexamined identity. At this first stage is the same as for minority identities. Individuals are aware of some physical and cultural differences, but they do not fear the other or think much about their own identity. There is no understanding of the social meaning and value of gender, sexual orientation, religion, etc. At the second stage, we have acceptance. It represented the process of internalization, conscious or unconscious, of a racist ideology. This may involve passive or active acceptance. The key point is that individuals are not aware that they have been programmed to accept this worldview. In the passive acceptance stage, individuals have no conscious identification with being white, straight, male, or other groups. However, they may hold some assumptions based on an acceptance of inequities in the larger society. Stage 3, resistance. The next stage represents a shift. It involves a move from blaming minority members for their condition to naming and blaming their own dominant group as a source of problems. This resistance may take the form of passive resistance with little behavioral change, or active resistance trying to reduce, eliminate, or challenge the institutional hierarchy that oppresses. Then we have stage 5. It's the integration. Majority group individuals now are able to internalize their increased consciousness and integrate their majority identities into all other facets of their identity. They not only recognize their identity as white, but also appreciate other groups. This process of integration affects other aspects of social and personal identity, including religion and gender. There are some theories that acknowledge that these kind of models are rather simplistic in explaining the diverse and complex experience that people have. Here in this process, it is not taken into consideration that different kinds of influences and impacts of the diverse environment around us and the socialization processes that influence how people experience their dominant identities or the realities of interlocking identities. What is important to conclude at this stage of our discussion is that it is very important when we talk about the identity issue to take into consideration that it is also important not only the way how we consider ourselves, how we perceive our habits, our values, our norms, but also how others perceive us in the process. And as I mentioned before, the perspectives of others, the time also affects the way we change over time. Then we have some other kinds of classifications of the identity, and in the general group of social and cultural identity, we have the gender identity. We often begin life with gender identities. When newborns arrive in our culture, they may be greeted with clothes and blankets in either blue for boys or pink for girls. We all know that. But gender is not the same as biological sex or sexual identity. It's a discussion that we all know about. We have the sexual identity. It refers to one's identification with various categories of sexuality. You're all familiar that here we have the heterosexual category, gay or lesbian, and perhaps bisexual categories. However, it varies from culture to culture and have been variously viewed throughout history. There are lots of theories about these issues. Then we have the age identity. As we age, we also play into cultural notions of how individuals our age should act, look, or behave. This is how we also develop the age identity. We might see, for example, some kinds of clothes, some things that we like. We look at the things that are displayed in store windows or advertised in the media, but we often have the feeling that we are either too old or too young for that kind of look. Then we have the racial identity and the ethnic identity. And short about these two identities. Race consciousness or racial identity is largely a modern phenomenon. For example, in the United States today, the issue of race is both controversial and pervasive. It is topic of many discussions, from television talk shows to talk radios. But still a phenomenon is observed that many people feel uncomfortable talking about it or think about it, and that it shouldn't be an issue in our daily lives. Ethnic identity, in contrast to racial identity, it may be seen as a set of ideas about one's ethnic group membership. It includes several dimensions like self-identification, knowledge about the ethnic culture, feelings about belonging to a particular ethnic group, etc. Now we proceed with one very important part in the theory of intercultural communication, and it refers to the barriers in the intercultural communication. You've all heard about these main problems that appear in the world of the intercultural communication. We have the stereotypes here, beliefs about the characteristics that are considered to be characteristic of a particular group, that particular groups are the only ones that could do particular things, or they feel that way. Prejudice, a negative attitude or affective response to a particular group and its members. And discrimination, unfair treatment of members of a group on the basis of belonging to that group. And we all know that there are discrimination on different grounds. For instance, what happens maybe in our context in this country, what we see through the media, because I belong to that world where media are often analyzed, and media often convey pictures, images, or stories that are related, that consist some kind of discrimination on, let's say, political grounds or on negative grounds. And it's really problematic because it's a phenomenon that is usually then transferred among citizens. They start to behave in a different way if they are often exposed to this kind of images or stories in the media. Prejudice is the tendency of individuals to think and feel in negative ways about members of other groups. And discrimination, what's the difference here is that discrimination is actual, overt individual behavior. They do not always occur together, and they do not always or necessarily have a casual relationship with each other. Prejudice as well as stereotypes can be positive or negative. For example, if an individual says, I don't want this and this group to live in my neighborhood, that is expressing prejudice. Then I think that it's also important to talk about the sources of prejudice. We have the social and the cognitive sources. Social sources of prejudice refer to the unequal stages and the social identity, while the cognitive refer to stereotypes and perceived similarities or differences. Social identity. We have a social categorization here, division in the so-called in-groups, that is us, and out-groups, which is them, the others. Our group is favored, while we feel some kind of an antagonism with against the group of the others. Cognitive sources of prejudice. The prejudice, as explained before, is a consequence of our thinking processes. And what happens when we possess stereotypes, which is a generalization of the social groups? It means that we process the information that we get from our surrounding in accordance with the stereotype that we already have. We focus, and then something happens following this process. We, from the variety of information that we have around us, we tend to focus to those information that are in compliance with the stereotype. We try to explain the world around us, the tendencies that happen, the events that happen around us as a result of the selected information that we have at disposal. We have a tendency to skip even very important information just to kind of approve the set of information and the stereotypes that we have in our heads. And that's why we have this third conclusion saying that we use silent conclusions so that the inconsistent information can appear as consistent. we all know that there are very complex processes around us, very complex problems, but we tend as people sometimes to simplify these processes as a result of possessing a couple of information, and we think that these information are the real ones, and we use those information to just build a proper conclusion so that we can put some kind of an order in around us in our thinking processes. I see that we have only 10 minutes left, so I would go to just this is just an illustration of what I briefly mentioned about the belonging to in and out groups. So there is a group organized among themselves with certain habits, with certain norms, certain values, and they consider themselves that they are in one group, and there is someone on the other side who is not the same as them. So when one looks at these groups, may often have a feeling that he or she doesn't belong to that particular group. So how it is determined what is in and what is out? Simply by creating and maintaining boundaries, either physical or symbolic. But there are other explanations as well. As I mentioned, we can always find some kind of reason to try to isolate ourselves from different people around us, from the others, and get integrated in smaller groups with others whom we perceive that accept our values, accept our norms. We have some similarities between us, and this is how isolation in these groups occurs. Some example here in groups versus out groups, those from the other religion, those who do not believe in God, and this list can be endless. If we just shortly think about it, we can always find someone who is different than us. What is certain is the fact that each and every in-group has its own out-group. Another phenomenon which causes barriers in the intercultural communication is the ethnocentrism. And the simplest definition about ethnocentrism is the degree to which individuals consider other cultures as inferior in comparison to their own culture. Often, members of the out-group are perceived as inferior, immoral, persistent in their expectations and requests, etc. And this, if there is a high level of ethnocentrism, we all know that it may lead to different kinds of conflicts, even war with an out-group, as was proven in many societies. On the other hand, when a threat from an out-group is perceived, the members of the in-group grow closer together. They integrate even more as response to such a situation. What is also specific about this phenomena is that it's not only intellectually comparing yourselves to another culture, but also, according to these well-known theorists, scientists Levine and Campbell, it also involves emotions, and very strong emotions when the degree of ethnocentrism is on a high level. There is another phenomenon which causes problems in intercultural communication, and it's considered a big barrier in the intercultural communication. It's the authoritarian personality. This personality thinks in terms of stereotypes and has strong prejudices towards outgroups of all kinds. It's a special blend of characteristics, opinions and values of the person which are common for individuals with an anti-democratic orientation. The characteristics of this personality may be the following: humility before authorities or some kind of idols, rigidity in the way of thinking, then we are prone to stereotypes, conservatism, conventionality, destructiveness, cynicism, etc. So different kind of features of these groups. But there is also something which kind of moves us to the more positive things that are in the intercultural world. It's the multicultural individual. This is a person who in their essential identity is inclined to accept different ways of life and who psychologically and socially accept the diverse reality. It's both intellectually and emotionally committed person to the basic unity of human beings, while at the same time he or she recognizes, accepts and appreciates the difference that exists among people. So to simplify things, this is the person who moves from one to another culture, who has experience belonging to different settings, different cultures, different worlds, and thus he or she is able to accept the complexities around us, the differences around us. This new type of personality cannot be identified according to the language or the languages he or she speaks, the numbers of countries visited, nor according to the size of international contacts he or she has made. It could be identified according to the way in which this person perceives the world and accepts the dynamic of living. Thus, we can use one word that explains this kind of an individual, and this is flexibility. It's a dynamic person which easily adapts. But also there is one small issue. I mean, it's not just a small issue. It's a problem which can sometimes really affect this kind of an individual. Sometimes they are prone to kind of depression, kind of a sense that they belong to different worlds, but at the same time they do not have their own world, because of this feeling that they are split among these different worlds and possessing features and characteristics, but they have sometimes problem in the consideration of their own identity and in the perception of their own identity. And the last thing that I would like to mention here is the phenomena. Maybe you've heard about this phenomena. It's the so-called cultural myopia. In this context, we mention it because in some way it describes the feeling of short-sightedness in relation to other culture and focusing only on our own culture. In a way, we are blind to what other cultures do and what is important to them. We are only we are strongly focused at what is important for us and for our culture and for our belonging to that culture. Reducing cultural myopia is something that is necessary, and it can be done through simple exposure to the influence of other cultures and getting to better know them and study them, this last sentence says a lot about intercultural, the necessity of possessing intercultural skills to be able to accept differences around us.